You're listening to the Plastic Shift Podcast. Welcome to the Plastic Shift Podcast. I'm Madhav Malhotra, one of the students at the Plastic Shift, and I'm reaching out to several experts working to solve issues with plastic pollution. This podcast showcases unique perspectives on this massive problem to identify what its most important aspects are.
Today, I'm lucky to be joined by Jay Sinha, co-founder and co-owner of Life Without Plastics, a mission-driven business aiming to increase access to plastic-free alternatives to everyday products with its online store, and also create more information around the health and environmental impacts of plastic waste. Jay has decades of experience with legal policy, scientific research, and entrepreneurship in this space, so I'm very excited to learn more about his unique perspective on this problem today. So thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm very much looking forward to learning more about your experiences over the decades, because it is very unique to consider all of the roles that you've been in and how that's shaped your perspective regarding this problem. And to start off, I thought it would be great to just hear a little bit about that journey and how that led you to getting started with Life Without Plastic now.
Well, thank you, Madhav. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to be on your podcast here. So thank you very much for the invitation. Well, my story goes back a ways, and it evolves originally from a general interest in the environment from childhood. And I think it really began probably in grade 6 when I was doing a project on acid rain. And it really fascinated me, just this whole idea that rain could be toxic. And from there, I became more interested in the environment, and going up into university, I always took environmental courses. I'm a great lover of nature, spend a lot of time in nature, camping, hiking. I love trees. I love forests, especially. So that's always sort of fed into my background and my lifestyle, my way of life. And in university, I did a biochemistry degree, and then I went to law school. And in law school, I always focused more, or tried to, as much on international and environmental oriented courses, and thinking I would eventually become an environmental lawyer, which I did to some extent. And I also did a diploma in ecotoxicology after doing law school, because I had jumped into the law and thought it would be good to have another dip back into the science. And ecotoxicology really fit with the huge impacts I thought were most negative on the environment in terms of chemicals coming into the environment. And I guess that perhaps goes back to that whole acid rain project back in grade 6. But with that sort of background, I moved through a number of different positions, some legal oriented and some more policy. I worked for a Canadian law firm, a large one, for a while that was more corporate oriented, but was excellent in terms of learning how the world works and how systems work, business and the economic system in general, and how laws and regulations play into that. In terms of other positions, I spent a lot of time in government doing policy work. I worked with Parliament, and also did some consulting work as an environmental consultant with the NAFTA Commission for Environmental Cooperation. And out of that, I really got an appreciation for more the governmental side of things and how the effect of regulation on issues such as the environment, and compared with having worked at the law firm where you're looking at it from more of a business perspective, is really, for me, quite illuminating, where with business, things happen quite quickly. And the ability to make change and to generate change and to be involved with change is quite quick. Whereas in government, it tends to happen much more slowly in terms of legislation being passed. So it's a different pace, but it's also addressing different things too. I think you really need both. So I've really enjoyed having that double perspective of seeing the public policy and then the private sector way of being. And the road to Life Without Plastic really began when our son was born. My former partner Chantal and I began the company Life Without Plastic just before our son was born, and we were looking for alternatives to glass baby bottles and could not find them anywhere at that point because they weren't that common. This was back in 2003. Now you see them everywhere, but at that point it was really largely plastic baby bottles. So Chantal had looked around on some research and found one company in the States that was still offering them, and they only did wholesale. So the minimum purchase was $1,000, and that was kind of the beginning of the company. And for us, the company is a bit of a hybrid. It's a mission-based company. So the plastics issue is at the foundation of it, both the health and environmental aspects, and as well this aspect of offering alternatives, solutions for people in their everyday life. So that's sort of how I came to it.
Yeah, it's really incredible to hear about all of those different roles and how they shaped the journey into life without plastics, but then at the end, how it was just a personal problem that was the kickstart to deciding that it was time for you to take action on that. It can be really hard for many existing businesses and potential entrepreneurs looking to start companies to figure out what is the problem here when it comes to what a business can address, what there is demand for, what people actually want when it comes to environmental solutions. And I know since that time where you just started off with the baby bottles to now, it's incredible to see how Life Without Plastics has so many options for all of these different aspects of everyday life. As you were starting to scale up, how did you go about establishing what people actually wanted, where there was actual demand, and what kinds of problems needed your attention most?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And for us, it's interesting because in terms of demand, it began for us with the plastics issue and our own demand. It came out of our personal search for alternatives to plastic. And when that began, the plastics issue was really not on the radar at all. So it was quite unique what we were doing, and a lot of people thought we were crazy, really, even members of our family. But in 2007, the Canadian government banned the use of bisphenol A, which is an endocrine disrupting chemical that was used in the making of baby bottles, a hard plastic called polycarbonate in particular. So it banned it for the use in baby bottles and in the lining of baby formula containers. That really put it on the mainstream media agenda to some extent, the plastics issue. And we were well poised. We were about 2 years into the business and somewhat established, and we became inundated with requests for our products, for the glass baby bottles, for water bottles that were non-plastic. It somewhat exploded. So to some extent, it was really a bit of luck and timing. And from there, it really just grew organically. With that impetus, the issue never went away from that point on. There were ebbs and flows, it went up and down, but we continued to bring in new products. And the tagline for our business is really safe, high quality, ethically sourced alternatives to plastic products. So we really tried to set ourselves apart by bringing in products that are high quality and that are ethically sourced. They're made in conditions that respect the environment and labor conditions as well. And we check out our suppliers and our sources very carefully in that respect. So that sets us apart for, dollar store items which are very cheaply made and often coming from the same countries under very sketchy conditions in which they are made. Based on that, we really built up quite a niche following. And it was niche then. It's becoming much more mainstream. It is much more mainstream now, for sure. I mean, we began with water bottles and baby bottles and some basic food containers, and now you see them everywhere, which is fantastic. That was always the goal, to get these products out there. And the result of that has been that the demand has changed for us, in that we are constantly looking for new products, innovations, plastic-free products that are hard to find in a non-plastic form. And I'll give you one example. We were looking for, my mother, when she was younger, growing up, had a ice cube tray that was made out of aluminum. And most of the ice cube trays tend to be plastic, but it was made out of aluminum and had a lever handle. And so based on that model, we decided to have made our own design of one made out of stainless steel. Aluminum is a metal that can leach and is linked to some toxic effects. So we wanted to make it out of stainless steel. So we just made it ourselves, and that became a very popular product. And things like that. Another one is popsicle molds made out of stainless steel. So looking for little areas where it's very hard to find something in a non-plastic form. And that's built us a following where people come back because they're looking for those innovations. And we also get lots of suggestions. So we're able to gauge the demand in that respect as well. We don't do really a lot of market research in terms of where the demand lies. We just kind of go with our flow on, and largely it's things we would like to see in a non-plastic form that cannot find. And we tend to have excellent feedback from our customers. We now have a really devoted following, a large social media following, and when people are looking for something, they just ask us. So we do get a fair bit of feedback in that respect. And that's, I guess, been our core way of gauging the demand up to now. I guess just a couple of other things I'd add in terms of engaging with our customers, which is absolutely core to what we do. Being a mission-based business, we are very much an educational resource as well. So we provide a lot of information on our website about the plastics issue, both the health and the environmental issues. And I think the most powerful tool that we have put out there in that respect has been our book. In 2017, we published a book which was really a decade's worth of experience and tips and tools on how to live with less plastic. But it was also a real deep dive into the issue, both from a scientific perspective and in terms of the environment and health. That's the first part of the book. We describe all the core different types of plastics and why there are health issues related to them, and the plastic pollution problem in depth as well. And then the second half of the book is all about ways to live with less plastic, very tangible, concrete, practical ways that anybody can implement, no matter where you are on the spectrum of living with or without plastic. Doing a personal plastic audit where you simply look around your life, your home, and go room to room and notice plastic around you, which for many people is really quite eye-opening when you begin to realize just how much plastic is a huge part of our lives. So that's been a great way to interact with our customer base and beyond, and in that respect, gauge the demand and where people are at on the issue. And it's just been growing.
Yeah. Along that, I'm sure that with your background, it must have been a little bit more helpful to get started. But I know for a lot of entrepreneurs, no one can do everything perfectly. And we were talking about the things like writing a book, like building online presence in terms of creating shareable resources, even with manufacturing new products. All of these things are such incredibly diverse skill sets and bring their own complicated challenges. Have you found that for you yourself, it was a huge personal journey in terms of addressing these needs, trying to learn new skills to get these changes to happen?
Absolutely. It's been a huge expansion. So my partner Chantal is really the more business side of the business. She has more of a commerce-oriented background as well in ethical business. She has a master's and my background is more the science and the policy. It's really worked well together, the mix of our skills, in terms of she is really more the product-oriented side of the business and running the business, and I'm more the content-oriented in terms of the actual issue and partnerships and customer relations, that sort of thing. But absolutely, through the whole thing, it's been a constant development of new skills, and it still is. And that's really what entrepreneurship is. You're constantly learning, and things just come up. I mean, every day is different, and issues come up. And as an entrepreneur and as a small business, and we began really as a very small business, a sole proprietorship, just the two of us, really, you have to do everything. You have to deal with everything. So, I mean, now we have a fantastic team behind us, which makes all the difference in the world. And it's at a point where Chantal and I can begin to really focus more on the parts that we really love, as opposed to having to do everything, and having people who are perhaps much more qualified to do certain parts that don't interest us as much. I mean, certain of the operations and marketing and things, but it's a constant ongoing learning journey and educational journey. And that's one of the beautiful things about it. And being a mission-based business and having that mission at the core has, in some respects, really fed the drive behind the business. And it's also, I would add, very key in terms of building our team, because the people, one thing has become very clear as we've built our team is that you can teach anyone just about anything in terms of skills to work with a business, run a business. I mean, obviously there are specialties like accounting and so on, and people have different experiences they bring. But if they aren't in sync or don't believe in the mission behind the business, the chances are it's not going to be a good fit. And that is completely played out in our past experience in terms of hiring and who we hire. So now our team is completely aligned with the mission. It's people who I think in large parts really don't even see it so much as a job, because they really know they are making a difference. And that's been very key for Chantal and I too, because we know we have made a difference. It's been almost 15 years, and we get the feedback from various different customers and partners that things are happening, and the impacts that some of the things we've done have actually had on people's lives. So that's very gratifying. And that really feeds us as well, keeps us going, because it can be very tough as a business owner, a small business owner, especially at this time with the pandemic and everything. We can get more into that, but there's never been a time like this with so many new challenges. But having that mission behind us helps to motivate us and push us forward to really innovate and pivot when we need to.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that curiosity and passion to pull you forward. You don't need to be forcing yourself to be determined and just struggling against the challenges when you have that intrinsic motivation.
Yeah, the type of business that we are, it is an enormous and growing movement. And that by that, I mean socially responsible businesses. There are certain organizations and certification bodies. For example, you might have heard of the B Corp. There are now thousands of them around the world, and we're in the process of actually applying to become one. And we kind of always have been one. In talking with Business Development Bank of Canada, who we've worked with a little bit on this application, they even interviewed us as though we were a B Corp, because it's really baked into our DNA. But that movement, for example, is becoming more and more mainstream, and people are beginning to look for businesses like that. Another one is Social Venture Circle, which is an organization of all kinds of different socially responsible businesses, ranging from Ben and Jerry's and Seventh Generation down to very small individual people making soap at home. So having that whole growth going on as well, and that community has been somewhat gratifying in the face of something like the pandemic, because it really does give not just the feeling, but the reality that, we're not in this alone. Everybody is going through it in the same way, and the mission is still important. And with the pandemic, for what we do and our particular mission, it has never been more important. Just as you well know, the plastic pollution problem has exploded as a result of the pandemic, with massive amounts of new waste from personal protective devices, masks and gloves showing up in oceans and on coastlines. So this is an issue that is not going to go away. And from the start, we've always focused on both the health and the environmental aspects. And I do believe, and this has been the case from the start, that the health issues are going to become more and more front and center, very serious, because the chemicals that are coming out of plastics are largely endocrine disrupting chemicals, which affect the hormonal systems in all living beings. And the hormonal systems direct all basic living functions of a human body and of other organisms as well. So these are long-term effects that don't show up right away, but these are chemicals that have now been in our systems for a long time. The amount are growing, and you can no longer hide from plastic. It will find you, even if you don't have much of it in your life. It's in the air, it's in the water. And that as well, I think, will help to generate more demand and also create new supply of plastic alternatives. We're at quite a transition point in so many ways on that issue and other issues as well, climate change. And I think massive change is coming. And that makes it a very exciting time to be alive, I think.
Yeah, I think it really is very exciting to consider all of the changes coming together, but also, as you mentioned, we're seeing all of these new problems that we should be rightly concerned about. And regarding this finally gets into the last area of questions I had for you, which were surrounding some of the future visions you have for how you could grow this organization. So, as you very clearly mentioned, the pandemic has sort of accelerated a huge trend we've been seeing in the past 5-10 years, where we know that oil production is not sustainable, and we're starting to see how shifts away from gasoline-powered vehicles. Hopefully, those are going to accelerate as much as possible, but in the meantime, the alternative to that for profit-seeking corporations is to transition to using oil for plastic production.
Yes.
And we've seen these trends for 5-10 years, and now after the pandemic, this has been a great opportunity for
Mm-hmm.
corporations to take advantage of. And personally, I don't fault them for doing that. I don't think that it's fair for corporations with hundreds of thousands of employees to not consider their own economic interests. But as you have shown, and as many, not even just small businesses, but growing mid-sized businesses are showing, it is possible to both manage economic incentives with a sustainable cause. And we've been very lucky to be able to hear about these stories. And regarding that, I was hoping to learn about your perspective on whether you're thinking about how you can set your business's example to be able to help guide others or show others an example of how it is possible to both be a proper business, profit seeking, and take care of one's employees, but then also consider the sustainable perspective that more and more consumers are demanding. If you were able to, what kind of lessons you might share with other small and large businesses?
Well, it's a complicated question because I do agree with what you said about large businesses having to take into account their employees and the profits that are required to keep a business going. I do believe also, though, that it needs to be done in an ethical way. And what we've seen from the plastic and chemical industry has not been terribly ethical in terms of trying to sway market messages to indicate that, for example, plastics are much safer than non-plastic alternatives during the pandemic, which the research has shown is simply not true. In fact, the virus can last much longer on plastics. But that aside, I think that a core element of running a business is serving the needs. But if those needs are causing more damage than good, then perhaps the business needs to rethink what it's doing. And as you have said, we are reaching, peak oil is an issue, climate change are enormous issues. These are massive global issues with reams and reams of scientific evidence backing them up. These are not tiny issues that have come out of nowhere. They're huge and they're affecting us all. And we're seeing the actual climate changes affecting us on a day-to-day level. Anybody who's living in the fires on the west coast of North America knows exactly what we're talking about. And these sorts of things, I think we're only going to see them becoming more and more serious, the environmental impacts. So I think that has to be taken into account. Now, if you're in a business like plastics, there are ways you can change. And we're seeing huge aspects of that through the whole circular economy movement, which has become very trendy and with good reason. It's a very powerful idea, and largely come out of the work of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation in the UK, which is fantastic work. And one of the interesting things about that is that it is really targeting these large multinational corporations, such as Danone, Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, who have massive amounts of plastic packaging, for example, in their product lines. There are ways for them to pivot, but it takes, and it comes back to a really interesting question, which is always on my mind and has been a core element of what we do, but it's the intersection between individual action and systemic action, and individual impact and systemic impact. Our focus has very much been individual. The products we put out there are for individuals, and they are meant to impact individual behavior and habit change. That's the core of the whole plastic problem, actually, is really habit change. It comes down to at the individual level. But then there's also the systemic element, which is more of an issue and a factor for large corporations, where they can have massive impacts on the way society as a whole is acting. And I guess the point I really want to get across is, though, even though it is systemic, there is the systemic element at that multinational level, the large corporations are still run by individuals. And in all my experience, through all the jobs I've had, whether it's been in the private sector or the public sector, it has always amazed me the amount of power that an individual can have at a very high level of influence, and how much they are very directly influenced by their own personal biases, whether those biases come from friends or family, which are the strongest influences on them, or from exterior other businesses, whatever it is. Their individual biases do have an impact. So it's a real anomaly to say that, to really distinguish completely the individual impact and systemic impact. I think the two are indelibly interlinked, and we have to take that into account. And for that reason, I think it's important that the work that we do helps to convince all individuals, regardless of what level you're working at, of the importance of the issues. When you have someone out there like Greta Thunberg, who is really getting the climate change issue out there on behalf of youth, and well, on behalf of everyone really, but as a youth doing that, the same impact can be had by the child of the CEO of a multinational on that parent. So in terms of influence that we could have, I've always thought the strongest influence is by example, setting an example of the way, what you do, how you do it. And the way we run our business is through the mission. So if a large corporation is in a position to really reflect on the change that's needed, then if they can pivot and look at new options for innovation and change, then now is the time. It's just never been a better time to be able to do that, because the world is ripe for new possibilities, new ways of change, even in terms of looking at new regulation, new ideas for ways to move forward.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree with that perspective. And we're going to be next interviewing an organization called As You Sow, if you've heard of them.
Yes, I have. Oh, wonderful.
Yeah. So it's exactly what you were talking about in terms of influencing individuals at, say, higher levels and thinking about the change that for them that they can bring with shareholders. So I definitely think that this is an important connection that most people, including myself, don't often think about in terms of the ways that these corporations, these massive entities that we think have so much influence over the world, at the end of the day, they're run by individuals with individual interests, and how the individual connects with the systemic element there. So I really think that's an amazing perspective and a novel insight to wrap up this podcast with. And I think that it was just amazing to hear about your entire story, with how you started with these different roles and how that's affecting the way that you thought today. So thank you for sharing that.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be here.
Definitely. And if anyone is curious to learn about Life Without Plastic, where might they go?
Well, lifewithoutplastic.com. Everything is there. We're also very active on social media through Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. And I highly recommend our book of the same title, Life Without Plastic. The subtitle is The Practical Step-by-Step Guide to Avoiding Plastic to Keep Your Family and the Planet Healthy. And that really gives an overview of what we do. And there are also other great partners out there that we work with. There's so many organizations now looking to reduce plastic pollution, yours included. So lots of resources out there.
Yeah, I think it will be great for people who are curious to explore those links. So I'll make sure to include some. And thank you again for joining me today.
Thank you, Madhav. My pleasure.